Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Cropper here with a few books about or with regards to Rome. History of Rome by Michael Grant, slightly popular. The Roman Way by Edith Hamilton, slightly cerebral. The God of the Machine by Isabel Patterson, quite cerebral. And a short account of the history of mathematics from W. Rouse Ball, from which we don't need much, and we'll get that out of the way first. I do want to make a quick quote from Michael Grant's book and follow it with something from the short account of history of mathematics. So Michael Grant has to say on the subject of Rome, and this is right in the introduction here. For although Rome forms part of a larger Greek-Roman story, it possessed a potent individuality of its own. The notion, which is still sometimes aired, that Roman culture was merely an imitation of its Greek models, is outworn and misguided in every field. On the contrary, in the literary and visual arts alike, as well as in law, and the governmental sciences, Rome's achievement was of singular originality and distinction. Now, I might give him so far as the law and government sciences, but I won't give him literary and visual arts. In fact, I'm going to destroy that case, Michael, Mr. Grant, sir. Now, if we just count literary and visual arts, if we count studies in astronomy and the sciences as part of literary, which I think we can do in the ancient world, then we will be happy to put mathematics as part of that. But Mr. Ball here, W. Rouse Ball, lets us know a little bit about what the Greeks had as far as mathematics, and then we'll get that out of the way and we'll go to the next bit of evidence. It is noticeable that all specimens of Egyptian geometry, and the viewer may know that the Greeks were supposed to have gotten their mathematics from Egypt and Phoenicia. All specimens of Egyptian geometry which we possess deal only with particular numerical problems and not with general theorems. Even if a result be stated as universally true, it was probably proved to be so only by a wide induction. Now, I pause there. It's true that math is an inductive science, but a very, very, very great part of the activity is deductive. So, don't start with me. It's true. It's an inductive science. I know they say it's a deductive science. They're wrong. And they say that they had to get away from induction in order to get math on the path of science that it's on today. But you can get away from the fact that it's an inductive science at its root. But continuing the quote, it says, "We shall see later that Greek geometry was from its commencement deductive." Now, we're not going to go that far, but there you go. Greek geometry was deductive. Now, all that they got from the Egyptians and from the Phoenicians were inductions, meaning a large number of rules from reality, from the five senses, that you then turn into a rule on paper. And that's very different from science as it is today, or from math as it is today, where you just go, you take a rule and you discover more and more stuff from the rule, and you take the rule and do this to it and do that to it, and it's all mathematics. It's all floating mathematics. But the stuff that they got from the Egyptians and Phoenicians was strictly reality-oriented. None of it was theoretically based. Then he mentions China, destroys the old myth that China had any mathematical theory at all. It didn't. It had, again, only inductive facts, and it was not systematized. You can look at the work of L.A. Sedillot, if you're into that, S-E-D-I-L-L-O-T, if you want to know exactly why the Chinese were not the mathematicians they've been rumored to be. But he says, aside from this stuff that we've gotten from the Phoenicians and the Egyptians on rules of thumb and wide injunctions, we may reasonably infer that from one source or another the early Greeks learned the use of the abacus and the symbols for recording results from the abacus, and some mathematics as far as is contained or implied in the Rind papyrus. This probably sums up their indebtedness to other races. So, if that's true, then it's going to be a very hard case for Michael Grant to make that Rome had its own individual originality when that is so rare in the races of men. And I definitely go with Edith Hamilton's view of the subject much more readily. She talks about the Roman way. She talks about Rome and Greece constantly. I mean, probably a third of the book, or like a fifth of the book, let's say, is probably about Greece and comparing Greece to Rome. And it's called the Roman way, and she wrote a whole book called the Greek way, but she didn't get it out of her system. You can never stop talking about Greece when you're talking about Rome. Well, Michael Grant, who says that the Romans have an individuality all of their own, I think is way off, and Edith Hamilton has a better way of looking at it. She says, in so many words, that of all the societies in the Mediterranean at the time, and since then, Rome is the one that became utterly transfixed with Greeks and with Greek culture. So if there was something important and individualistic in Greek culture, we can give the Romans credit for recognizing it and fixating on it and basically copying their entire culture, if rudely, after Greek culture. Now, when Michael Grant says that Roman culture was not just a copy of Greek culture, it had its own individual creations, he is doing Rome a disservice. You know, there are only so many societies in history, and there are only so many creative men. Most people aren't very creative, most societies aren't very creative. And Greece was. And Rome had the intelligence to recognize Greece and glom onto it and obsess over it from the 300s BC for the next 700 or 800 years. To be learned was to learn Greek, to know Greek literature, to know the Greek historians. Now, they ended up disparaging Greeks kind of the way we disparage bookworms and nerds and geeks, but you're still better off being smart in the modern world than dumb. And that's how it was in the ancient world, although Greeks eventually got a bad name because if you drag on for hundreds of years talking about how brilliant they are, someone's going to end up raising a dissenting voice, and they did. But Michael Grant doesn't give the Romans their due when he says the Romans had individuality in their culture. The Romans were a carbon copy of the Greeks in so many ways that it's ridiculous. Well, The God of the Machine by Isabel Patterson has some interesting tidbits about Rome and Greece. Rome, at the time of Rome and Greece both coming up, Rome was smaller and behind Greece quite a lot, by a couple hundred years. Greece was having its golden age 100, 200 years before Rome had even got Italy put together. So, and there's fuzziness in the numbers there because the Greek golden age was 100 years or so long, or 90 or 120. So the Greeks were actually conquering whole areas. They had colonies throughout Sicily and all across the toe and boot, the heel of the boot of Italy. It was called Graeca Magna, which means Greater Greece. That was all done before Rome had even conquered its little river valley, before it even owned the whole Tiber and the plain of Latium to the south of the Tiber. So Rome was still in its diapers when Greece was at war with Carthage. Now, Carthage is just a city that was founded by the Phoenicians. And it turns out that when Rome later destroyed Carthage, it was just sniffed out of existence. It wasn't like Rome or Athens, which they burned and destroyed several times and the cities rose from the ashes. Carthage, when it was destroyed, was gone forever. Symbolically, salt was sown there and so on, but they were just traders, the Carthaginians, the Phoenicians. They were just on the oceans. Now, it mentions here in The God of the Machine that the Carthaginians at one point were so confounded at the success of the Romans that they contemplated starting a land empire like the Romans had, but they didn't know how to go about it. They were a seafaring people. That's what they did. They owned Carthage, and they traded. The Mediterranean was their canvas for trading. They didn't they didn't found a land empire, but they had to fight the Romans, who were a land empire people, and the Romans didn't even have a navy. The Romans ended up building a navy to fight Carthage. So there's this crazy instance in history where the Greeks and the Phoenicians are fighting over the waters, in the over control of various important city-states on islands and stuff like that. And along comes Rome up out of nowhere and destroys Carthage. And then, and I quote from page 5, I know that's not far in the book, but here it is. At that point, the Greeks did not benefit by the ruin of their mighty antagonists, right? Rome was a backwater. It's Greece and Phoenicia fighting over the the Mediterranean. And Carthage, all of a sudden, Carthage is destroyed because Rome wasn't a naval power. How did they beat a naval power? Nor did the Greeks benefit by the ruin of their mighty antagonist. On the contrary, the subjection of Greece was soon to follow. Economic determinism failed. The subjection of Greece was soon to follow. So you've got this weird thing where these two superpowers are fighting, and a little guy comes out of the background and kills first one and then takes over the other. Now, out of those two cultures, one of them, that of the Carthaginians, the Phoenicians, disappeared like, into the wisps of time. Once it's gone, it's just gone. It just doesn't matter anymore. When the Greeks disappeared, they have left echoes through all the ages. When the Romans disappeared, they left their echoes, mainly echoes of Greece, through all the ages. When the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians disappeared, poof, they were gone. There was virtually nothing left of them. They were an enigmatic and wispy culture. Now, the Carthaginians, there they were, clashing all this time with the Greeks and didn't recognize the importance of the Greek culture. So, Michael Grant does a very big disservice by saying that Rome has its own individuality and its own creativity and the visual arts and stuff. No. Like most other societies, it was pretty uncreative. It did have some creativity, and if I do more videos about Rome, I can go into all that, about their literature and their poetry and stuff like that. But it needs to be pointed out, it needs to be admitted, to give the Romans full credit, that of all the societies in the ancient world, Rome was the only one that became utterly transfixed by the Greeks. Now, I hope that that's enough to convince some of you, ladies and gentlemen, that you might need to know some more about Rome, and maybe that Mr. Cropper's the person to provide that information. So, pay me on Bitcoin or using WePay. I think it is WePay. If you're interested in more from any of these books or from other books on Rome, and take that home with you. The Romans, they were copycats of the Greeks, and it's to their credit.